The rain tapped softly against the kitchen window as Margot leaned over the counter, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. Her mornings were quiet, almost too quiet, and the silence of her empty house had long since ceased to feel like a reprieve. It had been years since the kids moved out, and though she loved them fiercely, their visits had become sporadic, their lives busy with families and careers. Her days had fallen into a predictable rhythm: morning tea, a crossword puzzle she never quite finished, errands to the same stores, and evenings spent with books she half-read before falling asleep on the couch. At 52, Margot often wondered if this was all there was for her now, a quiet, unobtrusive existence that asked nothing and gave little in return. That particular Tuesday, like so many others, found her walking the aisles of the neighborhood grocery store. She moved slowly, lingering longer than necessary in front of the fruit displays and neatly stacked cans. It wasn't as if she was in a hurry to get back home. As she reached for a perfectly green apple, another hand brushed against hers. Startled, she looked up to meet warm, hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners as the man smiled apologetically. He looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, his dark hair slightly mussed, as though he hadn't quite recovered from the morning rush. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice light and easy. "Guess we're after the same perfect apple." Margot chuckled softly, surprised by the interaction. "It seems so. But I'll let you have this one. I'm not picky." No, please. You were here first." He held the apple out to her, and she noticed the faint dimples that appeared when his smile widened. She accepted the fruit with a quiet, "thank you," unable to help the small smile tugging at her own lips. For the rest of her shopping trip, she found herself stealing glances at him as they crossed paths in the aisles. There was an ease about him, the way he laughed with the cashier or paused to help an elderly man retrieve a can from a high shelf. When she found herself in line behind him at the checkout, he turned and smiled again. "You have good taste in apples," he said, gesturing to her basket, and she laughed, a sound she hadn't realized she missed hearing from herself. That's high praise coming from a fellow apple enthusiast. As they exited the store, he paused, holding the door open for her. "Well, it was nice bumping into you," he said. "Maybe I'll see you around?" "Maybe," she replied, her voice lighter than it had been in years. As Margot walked back to her car, the grayness of her day felt just a little less oppressive. She couldn't quite explain it, but the encounter lingered in her mind, a spark of light in the monotony she hadn't even realized she'd grown so accustomed to. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something new stir within her, though she couldn't yet name what it was. The following week, Margot found herself wandering the grocery store aisles again, even though her pantry was far from bare. She told herself she needed a few small things, some tea, fresh bread, and maybe a few of those green apples that had unexpectedly brightened her day. But deep down, she wondered if she might see him again. It was a foolish thought, really. People like him, young, vibrant, and busy, didn't linger in small-town grocery stores waiting for middle-aged women to cross their paths. But as Margot turned a corner near the bakery, there he was, peering at a shelf of fresh croissants with the same thoughtful expression she remembered. "Looks like we meet again," he said, glancing up as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Margot felt her heart lift in a way she hadn't expected. "I guess we both have good taste in breakfast," she said, her lips curving into a smile. This time, their interaction didn't end with a passing exchange. He introduced himself, Lucas, and they fell into an easy conversation as they strolled through the store. It turned out he'd recently moved to the area, working as a project manager for a local firm. "It's a little quieter here than I'm used to," he admitted, "but I'm starting to like it. People seem friendlier." Margot hesitated for a moment before replying. "It grows on you. There's a charm to the quiet once you adjust." Lucas grinned. "Maybe you can show me around sometime? You seem like you know the best spots in town." The offer caught her off guard, but she found herself nodding before she could overthink it. "I'd be happy to." Over the next few weeks, Lucas and Margot fell into an easy rhythm of friendship. They started with casual conversations whenever they bumped into each other, which soon grew into coffee outings and long walks through the nearby park. Margot introduced him to her favorite cafe, where the barista greeted her by name, and Lucas shared stories of his life in the city, his travels, and his ambitions. Though their lives were worlds apart, Margot found a surprising sense of ease in his company. He was kind and genuine, with a way of drawing her out of the shell she hadn't realized she'd built around herself. One afternoon, as they sat at a cafe by the window, Lucas leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know, Margot, you've made this move a lot less lonely for me. I didn't think I'd find someone to talk to like this, so soon." His words struck a chord deep within her. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed someone to talk to, either. Someone who listened, really listened, without judgment or pretense. "You've made my days brighter, too," she admitted quietly. It was true. In his presence, the monotony that had defined her life began to fade, replaced by a sense of anticipation and joy she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't sure what it meant or where it might lead, but for now, she was content to enjoy the warmth of this newfound connection. Margot had always thought herself too grounded to indulge in fantasies, especially the kind that tiptoed into dangerous territory. Yet, one evening, as she sat by her window sipping tea, she caught herself thinking about Lucas. It wasn't just his warm smile, or the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. It was the way he listened, how he seemed genuinely interested in the smallest details of her life. It was the way he made her feel seen. And then the realization struck her like a cold wind. She didn't just enjoy his company. She cared for him. Deeply. The teacup trembled slightly in her hands as she set it down. No. This wasn't what she'd intended. He was young, full of life and possibilities. She was 53, with laugh lines and years of quiet solitude behind her. This couldn't be what it seemed. But the heart had a way of bypassing logic. She replayed moments in her mind. The time he'd reached out to brush a stray leaf from her hair during a walk, the lingering pause before he said goodbye after their last coffee outing. Was she imagining it? Or was there something unspoken between them, something she was too afraid to name? For days, Margot tried to shake the feelings, burying herself in her routine. She reorganized the pantry, deep-cleaned her kitchen, and even took up knitting again. But no matter how busy her hands were, her mind betrayed her, wandering back to Lucas and the way he made her feel alive. The inner conflict was agonizing. Part of her wanted to cling to the friendship they'd built, to preserve it as something safe and uncomplicated. But another part, a quieter, braver part, yearned for more. One evening, after a long walk together through the park, Lucas turned to her with a look she couldn't quite decipher. "You're quiet tonight," he said softly. "Everything okay?" Margot hesitated, her heart racing. "I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" She opened her mouth to reply, but the words tangled on her tongue. How could she possibly explain the swirl of emotions he'd awakened in her? Instead, she shook her head and forced a smile. "It's nothing. Just one of those days." Lucas studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out, his hand brushing hers for just a second before pulling back. "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." The warmth of his touch lingered long after he'd left, leaving Margot with a bittersweet ache she couldn't ignore. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the truth settled heavily on her heart. She was falling for him, and no amount of denial could change that. But what could she do with these feelings? Could she risk everything, their friendship, her peace of mind, to explore what might be between them? Or would she bury her desires, forever wondering what might have been? The questions haunted her as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, knowing there was no easy answer. The realization of her feelings was like stepping onto a tightrope, suspended between hope and fear. Margot's mind became a battleground of emotions. At first, the thought of Lucas stirred an exhilarating rush, a sweetness she hadn't felt in decades. She found herself humming while watering her plants, lingering in front of the mirror before their walks, smoothing down her hair and adjusting her scarf. He had awakened something dormant, something she thought had withered away with time. But then came the doubts. "What are you thinking?" she scolded herself one morning, staring into her reflection. He's too young for you. This is foolish. Her mind ran wild with imagined judgments. What would her friends think if they knew? The whispers about how inappropriate it was for a woman her age to even entertain such an idea. Society had made it clear. Love was meant for the young, the vibrant. Not for a woman with gray streaks in her hair and hands worn from years of work. Margot tried to distance herself from Lucas, hoping the space would dampen her feelings. She skipped their usual coffee date, claiming she had errands to run. When he called to check on her, she kept their conversation brief, her voice tinged with an uncharacteristic coolness. But Lucas was persistent. "Margot, did I do something to upset you?" he asked one day, his voice heavy with concern. Her heart clenched at the sincerity in his tone. "No, Lucas, of course not," she lied. "I've just been busy." He didn't push, but she could sense his confusion. And in his silence, she felt the ache of what she was losing. The nights were the hardest. Alone in her small living room, she'd sit by the fire, her thoughts spiraling. She'd imagine a life where she wasn't afraid, where she could laugh openly with Lucas without worrying about judgment. She thought of how he'd never once made her feel old or out of place. To him, she was simply Margot. He seemed to cherish her stories, her wisdom, her presence. And wasn't that what mattered most? One evening, unable to bear the weight of her thoughts, she reached for her journal. The words spilled onto the page. Why does love come with so many rules? Why do we measure its worth by numbers, age, years, expectations? As she wrote, she began to confront the truth. It wasn't just the world's judgment she feared. It was her own. For years, she'd boxed herself into the idea of who she was supposed to be. And now Lucas was challenging that, making her question everything. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows. But beneath it, a quiet hope began to bloom. Perhaps love, in all its messy, unpredictable glory, was worth the risk. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. Margot stood by her kitchen window, watching the droplets race down the glass, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. It had been days since she'd seen Lucas, and the longing in her chest had only grown stronger. She missed him, his easy laughter, his presence that felt like sunlight through a cloudy sky. But still, the fear gnawed at her. Could she really invite him into her home? Into her life, this quiet, well-kept cocoon that she had spent so long building? She paced around the house, running her fingers along the spines of books that lined the shelves. She loved the comfort of solitude, the predictability of her days. Yet the thought of him, the way he made her feel seen and alive, was far more enticing than anything her solitary existence could offer. "Is this how it starts?" she murmured to herself. "Is this the moment where everything changes?" She paused by the door, hesitating. In the past, she had invited only a handful of people into her home, a few close friends, a neighbor or two. But Lucas was different. She couldn't simply dismiss the flutter in her stomach when he entered her thoughts. No, there was something deeper here. Taking a deep breath, she made up her mind. She would invite him. It wasn't so much about making a grand gesture as it was about acknowledging the quiet pull between them. Perhaps it wasn't too late to explore what was growing inside her, this unspoken connection that seemed to blossom more with each conversation, each glance, each lingering smile. She composed a message on her phone, her hands slightly trembling as she typed. "Lucas, would you be interested in coming over for dinner sometime this week? I thought we could cook together. I promise I won't make anything too fancy." It took her a few moments to press send. The seconds dragged on like hours. What if he didn't respond the way she hoped? What if he didn't feel the same way? Her phone buzzed. Her heart leapt in her chest. It was from Lucas. "I'd love that. Just say when." Margot exhaled slowly, her breath shaky but relieved. There it was. She had made the first step. The decision to invite him had opened a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through, but now that it was open, there was no turning back. As the days ticked down to their dinner, she couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building within her. Every time she caught herself thinking about Lucas, The butterflies returned, and the uncertainty settled deeper into her bones. What would it be like, having him in her space? Sharing a meal with him? Something intimate, personal. But the fear, while persistent, was beginning to fade into something else, a quiet excitement. She was nervous, yes, but the thought of Lucas in her home, their connection deepening, felt like a whisper of a possibility she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for a long time. That evening, as she set the table, her heart began to race. It was just dinner. Just a simple, innocent evening. But somehow, it felt monumental. It felt like the start of something that could change everything. She had taken the first step. Now, all she had to do was let him in. The doorbell rang, soft and tentative, yet unmistakable. Margot's heart fluttered in her chest, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She had spent the last few hours preparing, choosing ingredients carefully, setting the table with simple elegance, a linen cloth, a single candle flickering in the center. But now, as she approached the door, the weight of what was about to unfold settled over her. She opened it, and there he was, Lucas, standing on the other side with a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand, his smile as warm as ever. The sight of him sent a wave of emotion crashing through her chest. She hadn't realized just how much she'd missed him until this very moment. "You brought flowers," Margot said, her voice trembling slightly as she took them from him. "Just a little something," he said, his eyes lighting up with that familiar glint. "I wasn't sure if it was appropriate, but I thought you might like them." "I love them," she said, smiling in return, her nerves easing just a little. She stepped aside to let him in, and as he entered, she couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to have him in her home. His presence, so different from the silence she had grown accustomed to, brought a strange sense of peace. They moved to the kitchen, where the evening unfolded in a flurry of laughter and easy conversation. They chopped vegetables, stirred pots, and shared stories about their lives, small things, but significant to them both. Margot found herself laughing more than she had in years, the sound filling the corners of her home, like a melody. And Lucas? He seemed to thrive in her presence, effortlessly making her feel both seen and cherished. At one point, as they stood side by side near the stove, their shoulders brushed lightly. Margot felt the spark, the brief connection that sent a wave of warmth through her. She glanced up at him, her heart beating a little faster. His eyes met hers for a moment, soft, understanding, and in that instant, it was as if time itself had slowed. There was a depth in his gaze, a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. "I've always loved cooking," she said, the words feeling somehow heavier now, as though she was revealing something she hadn't admitted to herself in a long time. "I can tell," Lucas said, his voice low and sincere. It's just easy with you." She smiled, her chest swelling with an emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. There was something so simple, so comforting about the way he spoke. No pretensions. No expectations. Just the shared experience of being in each other's company. Dinner was finally ready, and they sat at the table, the light from the candle flickering between them, casting shadows that made the room feel more intimate than it had ever been before. They talked more, their conversation flowing like a gentle river, effortless and natural. Every time their hands brushed, or their eyes met across the table, it felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that was deepening between them. Margot couldn't ignore the way her heart beat in time with his laughter, the way her body warmed whenever he leaned in just a little too close, the way she wanted to savor the moment, stretch it out as long as possible. There was something undeniably magnetic about him, something that made her forget the years between them, the fears she had harbored, the judgments she thought might come. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. As the evening wound down and they cleared the dishes together, Margot felt a subtle shift in the air between them. It wasn't just the warmth of the meal or the wine they'd shared. It was something deeper, something unspoken, yet understood. Lucas stood by the door, about to leave, and for a brief moment, there was silence. He looked at her, his gaze lingering. "Thank you for dinner," he said, his voice softer now, almost like a whisper. "It was perfect." Margot smiled, her heart racing. "I'm glad you liked it." And then, before she knew it, his hand was on her shoulder, a gentle touch that seemed to linger longer than it should. "I'm glad I came," he said quietly, his voice carrying something that made her pulse quicken. The connection between them, palpable and undeniable, felt like a bridge, one that neither of them was willing to cross just yet, but one they both knew was there, waiting. As Lucas left, the door softly clicking shut behind him, Margot stood in the quiet of her living room, her heart full. She had opened a door tonight, one she hadn't even known she wanted to open. And as she sat down by the window, watching the last light of day fade away, she couldn't help but wonder what would come next. But whatever it was, she knew it would be something worth waiting for. The days that followed felt different. Every moment of silence in Margot's apartment now held a space for his words, for the warmth of his presence that lingered long after he had left. She couldn't help but replay the evening over and over in her mind, his smile, the easy rhythm of their conversations, the weight of his gaze that seemed to say so much more than words could ever express. It was a soft, steady echo that had woven itself into her daily routine, leaving her to wonder, how had something so simple, so fleeting, shifted the very fabric of her life? Margot sat at her kitchen table one afternoon, sipping tea, gazing out the window at the street below. The world outside had not changed, yet everything inside her seemed to hum with new energy. She found herself smiling for no reason, lost in thoughts of him, of their moments together. And yet, beneath the surface of this newfound joy, there was an undercurrent of doubt, a quiet questioning that gnawed at her. Could this really be happening? Could she, at her age, after all these years of solitude, really be developing feelings for a man so much younger than her? The question had plagued her since that evening, since his hand had lingered on her shoulder, since their unspoken connection had surged to the surface. She had spent a lifetime watching the world move around her, a passive observer, never quite daring to participate fully. Now, with him, it felt as though the ground beneath her feet was shifting. It was both thrilling and terrifying. She thought about the judgments of society, the whisperings of others. Her friends, those who had been married, those who had lived through decades of their own stories, would they understand? Or would they turn away, offering pity rather than support? Would Lucas's youth always be a dividing line, an unspoken barrier between them, one that could never truly be crossed? She had been conditioned to believe that love, at her age, was something that had passed her by. Her past was filled with memories of old friends, of lost opportunities, of the life she had chosen, one of quiet stability and resignation. But now, with Lucas, there was a whisper of something different, something forbidden, perhaps, but undeniably real. His laughter had become her favorite sound, his presence, her most anticipated part of the day. Yet, even as she longed for more, the fear of the unknown held her back. She had come to a place in her life where she had accepted the limitations of age, the inevitability of time's passage. She was no longer the young woman who had dreamed of grand love stories or fiery romances. The years had taught her to be cautious, to protect herself from the vulnerability of wanting too much. But Lucas, with his fresh eyes, his curiosity about life, made her feel something she had long forgotten, the fierce rush of possibility. Margot closed her eyes, breathing deeply. What had kept her from embracing this before? What was she afraid of? Was it the years between them, the fear of looking foolish or naive? Or was it simply that she had never allowed herself the luxury of truly desiring something beyond what was comfortable and predictable? The reality of age, of the lines on her face, the creaks in her joints, the quiet ache in her bones, these things were unavoidable. But they were not the whole of her. She wasn't defined by those things, not entirely. She could still love, still feel desire, still embrace the passions she had pushed aside for so long. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the world that continued to spin, indifferent to her thoughts. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city, and she felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She was not finished. She was not too old for love. She was not too old to take chances. In the stillness, Margot realized that love was not a matter of age. It was a matter of the heart. And the heart, no matter how seasoned by time, still had the power to surprise, to awaken, to embrace the unknown. She smiled to herself, a small, quiet smile, and for the first time in a long time, she felt no hesitation. Whatever came next, she would face it with open arms. The future, with all its uncertainty, was hers to embrace. Love, at any stage in life, was worth the risk. It had been weeks since that first evening, the one where Margot had finally invited Lucas into her home, into her life. Since then, things had blossomed in ways she couldn't have imagined. Their connection had deepened, yes, but it wasn't just the physical proximity or the quiet understanding between them that had shifted her heart. It was something more subtle, more profound, the realization that love wasn't just about passion or the grand gestures of youth. It was about finding someone who made you feel truly seen, truly heard, in all your complexities. Margot sat on the couch, Lucas beside her, both of them leaning into the comfortable silence of evening. She had invited him over for dinner once more, a simple meal of roast chicken and vegetables, the same comfort food she'd always cooked for herself in years past. But tonight it felt different. Their time together had become less about novelty and more about something real, something quiet but deep, like the steady hum of a song that had always been playing, waiting for her to tune in. It was then, sitting there with him, that she realized just how much she had changed over these past weeks. The woman who had once believed that love and longing were things of the past, confined to youth or to other people's stories, was no longer the woman she was now. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, maybe even decades. And it wasn't because Lucas made her feel young again. No, it was because he made her feel alive, full of possibility, even in the midst of her 50s. He saw her, not just the older woman or the one who was too scared to dream, but the woman she still was inside, vibrant, capable of love, capable of joy. Their love, their connection, was still quiet, still tender, but it no longer carried the weight of doubt. The fear of societal judgment had faded, replaced by the warmth of shared moments, of genuine care. They didn't have to announce their relationship to the world. They didn't need the validation of others. The truth was, they had everything they needed in the comfort of each other's presence, in the knowledge that what they shared was real, undeniable. Lucas, though younger, had brought something into her life she hadn't known she was missing. He didn't carry the same baggage of age and expectation that she did. His world was fresh and wide open, and in many ways, his enthusiasm for life had breathed new energy into hers. But it wasn't just about what he gave her. It was about what they gave each other. They were equals in this strange, unexpected journey, both learning from each other, both growing in ways they hadn't anticipated. His curiosity about her life, her past, her experiences made her feel valued, made her realize that her story, despite its years, was still worth telling. As she glanced at him now, their hands brushing as they reached for their cups of tea, she felt a deep sense of peace. The years that had once felt like a weight around her heart had now become something different, something beautiful. The lines on her face told the story of a life lived, and they didn't need to be erased or hidden. They were a part of her, a part of their journey together. There was no more hesitation, no more fear. She had let go of the doubts, the insecurities, and embraced the love that had found her when she least expected it. Margot looked out the window, the fading light of day casting a soft glow on the city below. She thought about how easily she could have missed this, how easily she could have let fear decide her fate. But she had chosen differently. She had chosen to open herself up to the possibility of love, to the possibility that age was no barrier to passion, to connection, to intimacy. Love, she realized, was not confined to a set of rules or expectations. It was something fluid, something that could happen at any time, in any place, for any reason. She smiled softly to herself. Love, in all its forms, was always worth the risk. And it was never too late to follow your heart. With a final glance at Lucas, she leaned in, her lips brushing his, and for the first time in her life, Margot knew that the world was hers to explore, on her own terms, at her own pace. Age had no hold on her now. What mattered was the love she had found, the love that had chosen her when she dared to embrace it. And that love would be her guide, her strength, for the rest of the journey. It was, in the end, the truest kind of love, one that came without expectations, without hesitation, and without limits.